Hollywood's golden age sparkled with beauty, power, and poise. But behind the glamour hid a gallery of fears, peculiar, private phobias that shaped even the strongest stars. These weren't just stage jitters. They were intense anxieties that ruled their lives and careers. From irrational dread to crippling panic, these are the 17 most bizarre phobias suffered by classic Hollywood's most iconic actresses. 1. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo, the mysterious Swedish icon of the silent and early sound era, wasn't just reclusive by nature. She was tormented by an extreme fear of crowds. Garbo's aversion went beyond shyness or introversion. It was a genuine, consuming phobia that defined the contours of her personal life and career. At the height of her fame in the 1930s, she famously refused to attend film premieres, industry events, or public celebrations. Even the red carpet, Hollywood's ultimate stage, held no appeal for her. She would rather vanish than face a throng of photographers, fans, or journalists. Garbo declined public speaking engagements and interviews, leaving journalists to speculate about her secretive persona. This fear shaped the way she worked. She often insisted that sets be cleared of unnecessary crew members, preferring an intimate filming environment where her anxiety could be kept at bay. Some directors even scheduled shoots around her psychological comfort. After her retirement in the 1940s, Garbo vanished into private life in New York, rarely photographed, avoiding society altogether. She strolled city streets in large sunglasses and scarves, sometimes in disguise, doing everything possible to avoid being recognized or approached. Her fear wasn't theatrical, it was profound, and it made her all the more enigmatic, a star so iconic that she became immortal precisely by stepping out of the spotlight. 2. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford epitomized glamour, poise, and cold precision on screen. But few knew that off-camera, she was plagued by mysophobia, a relentless fear of germs and contamination. This obsession wasn't a mere quirk. It governed her day-to-day behavior like an unrelenting command. Crawford's fear of germs began early, but intensified with fame. She would scrub her hands repeatedly throughout the day, sometimes until her skin cracked. Her home resembled a sanitarium more than a residence, everything polished, pristine, and arranged like a museum. Guests were asked to wash their hands before entering and avoid sitting on certain furniture. Her staff followed military-grade hygiene standards. On movie sets, her germophobia came with her. She brought her own utensils and linens, insisted on sanitized dressing rooms, and avoided direct contact with makeup artists unless absolutely necessary. Co-stars and directors found her fastidiousness difficult but unchallengeable. She was Joan Crawford, after all. But beneath that exterior of control lay a woman afraid of invisible threats. Crawford viewed germs as agents of chaos, something she couldn't dominate with charisma or money. Her fear created emotional distance from those around her, making her appear icy and unapproachable. Her obsession with cleanliness extended to her children as well. In her daughter Christina's memoir, Mommy Dearest, Crawford's compulsions were described as rigid and punishing. Whether or not every claim was true, the public began to see a different side of the star, one shaped by fear, not just fame. Crawford's image was always about control, but behind that image stood a woman who couldn't control her own dread of the unseen world, one she tried to scrub away, but never could. 3. Katherine Hepburn. Katherine Hepburn was the very definition of bold. She challenged gender roles, defied studio bosses, and lived by her own rules. But behind her fierce exterior was a hidden vulnerability. an intense fear of public speaking that haunted her throughout her legendary career. This wasn't mere nervousness. It was a crippling phobia. Hepburn detested standing in front of a live audience, her voice exposed without the safety net of a script or character. Even brief acceptance speeches filled her with dread. She famously skipped the Oscars on multiple occasions, even when she won, because the thought of delivering a speech was unbearable. Her discomfort extended to interviews and press events. When forced to speak publicly, she came off stiff, hurried, and visibly uncomfortable. Colleagues noticed how meticulously she rehearsed dialogue, not just for perfection, but to overcome paralyzing anxiety about messing up in front of others. She even declined some theater roles due to the pressure of speaking live. For someone who loved the art of storytelling, this limitation felt like a betrayal. But film, where scenes could be retaken, offered her protection. She could be powerful on screen, but safe behind the lens. Later in life, Hepburn's fear never fully subsided, though she became more selective with appearances. Her confidence on screen became a paradox. How could someone so self-assured be so terrified? Yet perhaps that's what made her great. She wasn't fearless. She overcame fear every time she stepped in front of a camera. The same voice that once trembled in interviews gave us some of cinema's most commanding performances. 4. Rita Hworth. Rita Hworth dazzled the world as Gilda, the sultry siren with the magnetic smile. But beneath the glamour and fame lay a haunting fear that ruled her personal life, an overwhelming phobia of crowds. Unlike stars who simply preferred privacy, Hworth experienced full-blown anxiety in large gatherings. Award shows, movie premieres, and press events often proved too overwhelming. She'd arrive at events and then leave early or skip them entirely. She wasn't just avoiding fans, she was running from panic. Her fear had ripple effects on her career. While she was comfortable in front of the camera, the public side of stardom left her drained. Even interviews were a chore. Hworth often appeared distant or distracted when speaking to the press, not because she was aloof, but because she was quietly panicking. Privately, she preferred small, trusted social circles. She surrounded herself with people who knew how to navigate her fear without pushing boundaries. Large parties and industry mixers were out of the question. She often spent evenings in solitude, behind closed doors. Ironically, her on-screen image, glamorous, seductive, confident, was completely at odds with her internal reality. That contrast made her both adored and misunderstood. She became an icon of desire, but what she truly desired was peace from public attention. Hworth's fear of crowds was a hidden wound, a vulnerability she rarely shared, but one that deeply shaped her existence. In the end, it was her performances, not her parties, that made her unforgettable. 5. Mae West. Mae West, flamboyant, witty, and unapologetically provocative, spent her entire career defying expectations. But there was one force even she couldn't joke away: an intense fear of aging. West built her career on being a timeless attraction symbol. Her comedic one-liners and sultry walk became legend. But behind the scenes, she was terrified of growing old, not just physically, but professionally. She feared becoming irrelevant in an industry obsessed with youth. This fear influenced everything: her wardrobe, lighting choices, makeup, and even co-stars. She hired younger male leads to maintain the illusion of youthful desirability. West demanded that her scenes be lit with special lenses and filters to soften her appearance. As her age advanced, so did her use of wigs, body contouring costumes, and heavy makeup to mask the truth. Socially, West surrounded herself with younger companions. Her homes were adorned with mirrors, but only flattering ones. She avoided photos taken in natural light and preferred to be filmed from specific angles that maintained her image. Her fear wasn't rooted in vanity alone. For West, youth equaled power. Aging meant losing control over how the world perceived her, a loss she couldn't stomach. Even in her 70s, West played characters in their 30s. Her final film roles were campy and surreal, but she stayed committed to the illusion. To admit age would be to admit decline, and Mae West never believed in going quietly. Her fear of aging wasn't just cosmetic. It was a refusal to fade, a battle against time itself, fought in sequins and stilettos. 6. Bette Davis. Bette Davis was a powerhouse, fierce, ambitious, and unforgettable. But for all her commanding presence and sharp tongue, Davis carried a secret fear that haunted her until the very end, the fear of being forgotten. It wasn't just a worry about aging, it was an existential dread of fading from public memory and being replaced. This fear drove Davis to work tirelessly, often pushing herself into demanding roles when most actresses her age were fading into the background. She was known to fight fiercely with directors and studios to keep her name relevant, often choosing controversial or difficult roles to stay in the spotlight. She wasn't afraid to age on screen, but she was terrified of being overlooked. Off-camera, Davis kept scrapbooks of reviews and photographs, preserving every moment of her stardom. She saved fan letters, awards, even newspaper clippings, anything that reminded her of her cultural weight. She made a point to write her own memoirs, not once, but twice, determined to tell her story, before someone else erased or twisted it. Even in later years, Davis rarely took a break from the industry. She appeared on talk shows, television dramas, and even horror films, anything to remain visible. Her razor-sharp wit, her bold public appearances, and her refusal to retire were all part of the same desperate drive to never be left behind. Her famous quote summed it up: "Without wonder and insight, acting is just a trade. With it, it becomes creation." Davis wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of irrelevance, and that fear, paradoxically, may be what kept her legacy so enduring. 7. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe lit up the silver screen with sensuality and charm, but her internal world was a far cry from the glamour she projected. Beneath her breathy voice and megawatt smile was a profound fear of rejection, one that followed her from childhood into the final days of her life. Abandoned by her father and shuffled between foster homes, Monroe's early years were shaped by instability and longing for acceptance. These formative wounds morphed into an acute phobia, an almost obsessive need to be loved, validated, and chosen. Her professional life was riddled with anxiety over not being good enough. On set, she was notorious for needing reassurance. She'd ask directors and co-stars over and over if she was doing well, if she looked okay, if the audience would like her. She sometimes froze during filming, unable to say lines out of fear that she'd be judged or mocked. Off-screen, her relationships mirrored this fear. She sought partners who could protect her emotionally, Joe DiMaggio, Arthur Miller, but often ended up feeling more isolated. When faced with criticism, she'd spiral into self-doubt and withdrawal. Monroe took acting classes into her 30s, not just to improve her skills, but to prove, mainly to herself, that she belonged. She once said, "I don't want to make money. I just want to be wonderful." That wasn't vanity. That was the plea of a woman who feared not being enough. Monroe's fear of rejection wasn't her downfall. It was her wound. And while it fueled some of the greatest performances in cinema history, it also made her tragically fragile in a world that devours the delicate. 8. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's voice could break hearts, but inside, she lived with a crushing fear of failure. From the moment she sang "Over the Rainbow" as a teenager, the world expected her to be magical, and she felt she could never live up to that promise. Her mother pushed her into stardom early, feeding her amphetamines to keep her working and barbiturates to make her sleep. This toxic routine planted the roots of perfectionism and of terror. Garland believed that if she failed even once, the world would stop loving her. As an adult, she battled with intense performance anxiety. Before going on stage, she would often tremble, throw up, or have emotional breakdowns. She feared that one missed note, one forgotten line, would shatter the illusion. And the illusion was all she had. This fear followed her through failed marriages, financial crises, and public scandals. Every time she stumbled, tabloids pounced, and she internalized every headline. She believed, deep down, that failure was not just an event, but a confirmation that she was unworthy. Yet, Garland kept singing. She stood on stages when her hands shook and belted notes through tears. Her vulnerability made her performances electric, but behind that spark was someone terrified of disappointing the world and herself. Garland's fear wasn't irrational. In a ruthless industry, failure had real consequences. But for Judy, it wasn't just a professional hazard, it was an emotional avalanche she tried her whole life to outrun. 9. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was one of Hollywood's most irresistible sirens, a woman whose beauty made men stammer and cameras worship. But when it came to emotional intimacy, she recoiled. Beneath her sultry allure was a deep-seated fear of closeness, of being truly known. Gardner's childhood was marked by poverty and instability, and she grew up learning not to rely on anyone emotionally. As a result, she developed an intense need for freedom and control, especially in relationships. She was notorious for entering whirlwind romances that fizzled out once real vulnerability was required. Her marriages to Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and Frank Sinatra were chaotic and short-lived. Friends noted how Ava would emotionally retreat the moment things got serious. She preferred affairs over commitments, passion over intimacy. She once confessed, "I made it very clear from the start that I wasn't going to be owned." On screen, Gardner played fiery, untouchable women, an extension of her own emotional armor. She could seduce a crowd, but let no one close. Even in interviews, she was guarded, avoiding personal questions and masking emotion with sarcasm or indifference. This fear didn't make her cold. It made her human. Ava longed for love, but was terrified of what came with it: vulnerability, dependence, and the risk of heartbreak. Her glamour was a shield, and she wore it like armor. Behind the legend of Ava Gardner was a woman constantly fleeing the one thing she truly wanted: connection. 10th. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich, with her angular cheekbones and androgynous elegance, crafted an image of flawless mystique. But few knew that behind her perfectly lit portraits and iconic style was a woman tormented by a unique fear: cacophobia, the fear of ugliness. Dietrich was obsessed with her appearance, not out of vanity, but from dread. She believed beauty was her power, and that any deviation from perfection would render her obsolete. She traveled with her own lighting kits, insisted on strict camera angles, and spent hours inspecting how each shot captured her. Her fear bordered on obsession. She reportedly refused to be seen without makeup, even by close friends. Mirrors were positioned throughout her homes and dressing rooms to ensure constant self-monitoring. She scrutinized every photograph and demanded retakes, if even one strand of hair was out of place. As she aged, the fear only deepened. Dietrich became increasingly reclusive, avoiding public appearances and rejecting roles that didn't maintain her image. In later years, she rarely left her Paris apartment, hiding not from fans, but from her own reflection. Ironically, Dietrich's cinematic beauty became immortal, frozen in time. But for her, it was never enough. Her fear of ugliness wasn't a superficial concern, it was a crippling anxiety that made her a prisoner of the very image that made her famous. 11. Vivian Lee. Vivian Lee, best known for her hauntingly beautiful performance as Scarlett O'Hara, was no stranger to emotional turmoil. But beyond her fiery characters and luminous presence lay a deeply rooted fear, one that eclipsed fame and fortune, a fear of losing her mind. Lee suffered from bipolar disorder, though during her lifetime it was largely misunderstood and unspoken. As the illness took its toll, Lee developed a terrifying awareness of her mental instability. She once confided to friends that she feared going mad more than death itself. That fear wasn't hypothetical. It was lived and relived in episodes of manic energy followed by crushing depression. During filming, especially in later years, her erratic behavior alarmed colleagues. She would sometimes forget lines or burst into fits of rage or sorrow with no warning. But her greatest anguish was internal. The fear that she would one day completely lose control and no longer recognize herself. This fear of madness shaped her choices. Lee turned down roles she felt were emotionally too taxing, and she clung to structure, scripts, routines, habits, as a way to anchor herself. Off-screen, she became more private and guarded, desperate to maintain the illusion of composure while internally bracing against mental collapse. Her fear wasn't irrational. She lived inside the very illness she feared, experiencing it in waves. The tragedy of Vivian Lee isn't just her decline. It's that she knew it was happening and fought against it with everything she had. Her brilliance was born from struggle, and her fear of madness was the shadow behind every luminous performance. 12. Jean Harlo. Jean Harlo, the original platinum blonde bombshell, exuded confidence, sensuality, and a devil-may-care charm that made her a 1930s icon. But behind the sultry smile lay a paralyzing phobia, the fear of surgery, specifically dying under anesthesia. Harlo's fear stemmed from childhood trauma. As a young girl, she had witnessed the complications and long recoveries of close family members after surgery. This, combined with the medical uncertainties of the era, left her with a lifelong terror of hospitals and procedures. Even dental work left her shaken. She avoided routine medical checkups and refused to undergo recommended treatments, even when they were medically necessary. Friends and co-stars were alarmed by her resistance to seeing doctors, but Harlo dismissed it with a laugh or a joke, never revealing how deeply the fear ran. Tragically, this phobia may have contributed to her untimely death. At just 26, she suffered from kidney failure, then called uremic poisoning. Doctors reportedly recommended hospitalization and intensive treatment, but Harlo delayed. By the time she was admitted, it was too late. Rumors swirled that her hesitation came from her dread of surgery and hospitals. Jean Harlo's fear wasn't vanity or melodrama. It was a deeply embedded terror of surrendering control, of being unconscious, vulnerable, and possibly never waking up. And it ultimately became a fatal silence in a career that had only just begun. 13th, Theda Bara. Theda Bara, one of early cinema's most enigmatic stars and original vamps, portrayed danger and seduction like no other. But in stark contrast to her screen persona, Bara lived with a consuming fear of fire. This wasn't an idle anxiety. It was an overwhelming dread born from her upbringing during a time when fire-related tragedies were common. She witnessed a neighbor's house burn down as a child, and the screams she heard that night never left her. From that moment on, she obsessed over fire safety. She refused to stay in homes with open flames or fireplaces. Hotel bookings had to meet her strict no candles and multiple exits policies. She demanded fire drills on sets, and when pyrotechnics or torches were used in film scenes, she either used body doubles or avoided the project altogether. Even in her lavish home, she had escape ladders installed on multiple floors. She kept a bucket of sand near her bed and would check wiring and outlets obsessively. Her staff was trained in emergency fire procedures, and she often asked guests if they knew where the nearest exit was. Her fear was mocked by some peers, but Bara never relented. For her, fire symbolized chaos and helplessness. As an actress who controlled her image with meticulous care, the idea of being reduced to ash by something so wild and indiscriminate was too much to bear. Behind the sultry eyes and exotic costumes was a woman always calculating her escape, her every decision a quiet rebellion against the flames she feared. 14. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson embodied the excess of silent-era stardom, glittering jewels, opulent gowns, and aristocratic poise. But her lavish tastes masked an intense and haunting fear, the fear of poverty. Swanson had known hardship. Before her rise to stardom, she experienced the sting of financial struggle and swore never to return to that life. As her fame skyrocketed, so did her spending, not just out of luxury, but from a panicked belief that wealth was her only shield against obscurity and destitution. She diversified her income, invested in fashion lines, cosmetics, and even real estate. But she kept most of her financial dealings secret, often obsessively checking her earnings and demanding full control over her contracts and royalties. Her entourage described her as paranoid about money, with multiple bank accounts and hidden stashes of cash for emergencies. This fear extended to her career. Swanson accepted roles she disliked to avoid financial decline and refused to retire, believing that inactivity might lead to invisibility, and invisibility to poverty. Even after her memorable comeback in Sunset Boulevard, she kept working, appearing in theater, TV, and public appearances well into her later years. Her public persona exuded confidence, but behind the sparkle was a woman constantly looking over her shoulder, dreading the day the money ran out. Swanson didn't fear losing fame. She feared losing the security it bought. 15. Hedy Lamar. Hedy Lamar was more than a screen siren. She was an inventor, a pioneer in radio frequency technology, and one of the most intelligent stars of her time. But few knew she carried a secret phobia that shaped her interactions. Agoraphobia, the fear of crowded or uncontrolled spaces. Despite walking red carpets and dazzling audiences, Lamar dreaded packed theaters, bustling streets, or any setting where she felt trapped. Her anxiety heightened in public gatherings, even at studio events. She would sometimes arrive late or leave early, feigning illness or discomfort to avoid attention. This phobia grew worse as her fame rose. She began insisting on private entrances and exits, secluded booths at restaurants, and bodyguards, not just for protection, but for psychological comfort. She turned down events that required mingling and eventually stopped attending Hollywood parties altogether. This fear likely stemmed from her refugee experience fleeing Nazi-occupied Austria, where panic, surveillance, and loss of control shaped her early adult life. Even in the safety of Hollywood, she never shook the unease. Yet her performances were mesmerizing, perhaps because the camera gave her control. In a studio, she could dictate her environment, but in a crowd, she was just another body in motion, subject to chaos. Hedy Lamar's brilliance, both on-screen and in science, was often overshadowed by her beauty. But behind the striking eyes was a mind constantly scanning for exits, a genius hemmed in by her own fear. 16. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck commanded respect, with a tough-as-nails attitude and penetrating screen presence. Yet the very emotions she channeled into her roles were the ones she fiercely guarded in real life. Stanwyck harbored a potent fear, not of death, failure, or danger, but of emotional exposure. Orphaned young and passed between foster homes, she learned early that showing vulnerability could invite pain. As a result, she cultivated a stoic persona, both on and off the set. Colleagues noticed how she kept her personal life locked away, rarely discussing feelings, heartbreaks, or fears. She presented strength so convincingly that few ever saw the cracks underneath. This fear influenced her relationships. Her marriage to Robert Taylor, though publicly celebrated, was riddled with emotional distance. Friends said she loved deeply, but refused to show it, terrified that expressing tenderness would weaken her. Even in her acting, she preferred roles that emphasized strength over softness. When required to cry on camera, she often had to step away from the set to regain composure. The fear of breaking down in front of others was too great. Stanwyck's fear wasn't theatrical. It was a survival strategy born from early wounds. But it also became her paradox. A woman so skilled at portraying emotion, yet terrified to feel it in real life. 17. Tula Bankhead. Tula Bankhead was the epitome of flamboyance, booming laughter, sharp one-liners, and a voice that could hush a room. But that legendary voice also haunted her. Bankhead had a phobia that few understood, a crippling fear of losing her voice. To her, the voice wasn't just a tool, it was her identity, her weapon, her soul. Any slight hoarseness would send her into panic. She frequently visited ear, nose, and throat specialists, even when nothing was wrong, demanding reassurance that her vocal cords were intact. She carried herbal tonics, lozenges, and humidifiers wherever she went. Before performances, she observed rigid vocal rituals, no alcohol, no shouting, and near monastic silence for hours. If a role required intense yelling or long speeches, she would ask directors to adjust the dialogue to protect her vocal strength. This fear bled into her social life. She sometimes declined speaking engagements or interviews if she felt even the slightest strain. When asked why, she reportedly replied, "What's a lioness without her roar?" Bankhead's voice wasn't just sound, it was armor. And the idea of losing it meant losing everything she used to command the world's attention. Her fear was real, irrational perhaps, but rooted in an artist's need to preserve her one irreplaceable gift. Behind Hollywood's golden curtain, these iconic actresses carried invisible shadows, phobias that shaped their lives, performances, and legacies. Their fears made them human, their vulnerabilities unforgettable. In a world obsessed with image, they fought private battles the cameras never saw. And maybe that's what made them timeless, flawed, fragile, and fiercely unforgettable.